Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We begin in the name of Allah. All praise and glory be to Allah, and may His finest peace and blessings be upon His Messenger Muhammad and his family and his companions and all those who adhere to his guidance. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to make all of our actions righteous and make them sincerely for His sake, and not allow any of His creation a share of our intentions. May Allah purify our hearts with faith and beautify our character internally and externally with the character of His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we welcome everyone back to the Venom and the Serum, the discussion that Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah puts forth for those that feel addicted to a life of sinfulness, of disobedience, of aversion to Allah Azza wa Jal. And after going through some of the fundamental aspects of the cure, knowing that there's a cure, relying on dua above all, supplicating to Allah above all else, and then speaking about the many dangers of committing sins that can go overlooked or underestimated, I wanted to dedicate one session today to his discussions on the war tactics of Shaytan against man, the war tactics of the devil against the human being. He has a section dedicated to this, but also has points around it scattered throughout the book. I tried to consolidate them all in one place. Perhaps there is benefit in that. Because Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, like so many scholars, they don't have a Google Doc in front of them. Many times they write this stuff, in their downtime, on camelback, in the prison cell, right? And so even if you want to change something, it's probably not worth it. So you just leave it in a later chapter at times. Their minds were so salient, the facts were so much of a torrent unfolding that one thing would remind them of another, and it would be a shame for them to leave it out sometimes, so they'll just add it at a later place. There's no eraser, there's no sort of edit and go back. And so sometimes it is easier the way we think, especially nowadays, for us to rearrange a little bit. And so I hope that will be helpful, inshallah. So basically, he goes on to say, listen, every time you commit a sin, every time you disobey Allah Azza wa Jal, you are supplying Shaytan with more and more leverage against you in the war that he has already declared against you. And how can one expect to proceed safely to Allah Azza wa Jal if they are doing that? Because Shaytan already doesn't need any leverage, and he'll come back to this. And then he says, and there's nothing more humiliating either than being the prisoner of your worst enemy. Nothing worse. Sometimes you can get contained or detained, and it's like a misunderstanding, or it's in the course of justice, or it's temporary, or it's by a just ruler. But this is someone who is your worst, most sworn enemy. And he gives the analogy of the sinful heart or the sinful life is like that of a bird. He says, when the bird is able to rise, take off, fly, it distances itself from the dangers. But when the bird gets closer to the ground, when it lowers itself, that is when the predators are able to prey on it. It sort of becomes more vulnerable when it is on the ground. So it prefers to be in safety for as long as it can, prefers to be in the skies. And so Shaytan is our predator. There is a hadith that he cites that's reported about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wherein he said, "Ash-shaytanu dhi'bul insan," that the Shaytan is the wolf of the insan, the wolf of the human being. This hadith, it's very controversial whether it is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, did he say these exact words? But the concept of the Shaytan being the human predator is well established throughout. There's an authentic hadith, for instance, that says, stick to the jama'ah, stick to the community, because the wolf only eats the stray sheep, right? And the beginning of the hadith actually speaks about Shaytan and his attempts, his schematics, when he tries to entrap the human being. And so you can't stray from the flock. Ibn al-Qayyim gives the other example of the lamb now. He says the lamb, when the lamb strays from the when it is unguarded by the shepherd, the wolf will hunt it down. There's no way for the lamb to survive on its own, right? And when the lamb comes closer to the shepherd, comes closer to the guardian, then the wolf backs off, doesn't attack. He says, so your guardian is Allah, your shield is your taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The more you have of that, the more protected you are. The more distant you are from that, the more vulnerable you are. And he says there's degrees of distance. There's the distance of heedlessness, ghafla, when you sort of interrupt your dhikr, your mindfulness of Allah. That's a little bit of distance. Sinfulness shoots you very far, right? And then the greater the sin, the greater the distance. Like shirk could be the worst of all, or nifaq, hypocrisy, and the likes. And he mentions a statement from one of the Salaf, one of the early Muslims, wherein they said, رَأَيْتُ الْعَبْدَ مُلْقًا بَيْنَ اللَّهِ وَبَيْنَ الشَّيْطَانِ. I see, meaning I imagine, from what I understand from the Quran and Sunnah, right? I imagine the servant tossed in the middle between Allah and between Shaytan. فَإِن تَوَلَّاهُ اللَّهِ. If Allah undertakes, assumes responsibility for him, if Allah takes him in, Shaytan can't touch him. And if Allah does not take him in, Shaytan is able to devour him. Then he, Ibn al-Qayyim, invokes the ayah in Surah Al-Kahf. Surah Al-Kahf, Allah Azza wa Jal says, what about Shaytan? He says, and recall when we said to the angels, prostrate to Adam, so they all prostrated, except for who? Iblis. كَانَ مِنَ الْجِنِّ فَفَسَقَ عَنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّهِ. He was among the jinn. He wasn't an angel. He had agency, he had a will. And so he was able to rebel from the command of his Lord. That's the first part of the ayah. The second part of the ayah, because there's a connection he's going to draw right now. The second part of the ayah says what? أَفَتَتَّخِذُونَهُ وَذُرِّيَّتَهُ أَوْلِيَاءَ مِن دُونِي وَهُمْ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌّ بِئْسَ لِلظَّالِمِينَ بَدَلًا. Will you then, after this, right? Will you then accept him and his allies and his offspring as allies instead of me, and they are clear enemies to you? What an awful exchange the wrongdoers make. Anyone who does that is a wrongdoer that has done a horrible trade-off. To accept Shaytan as your ally and not accept Allah Azza wa Jal as your ally. So what's the relationship between the beginning of the ayah and the end of the ayah? Ibn al-Qayyim says there's three things to notice here. The first of them is the relationship between the beginning and the seal of this verse. The first thing is Allah saying, I honored you. I gave you so much prestige, O human being. I made every last one of my angels prostrate to you, salute to you in prostration out of respect. And after I do all this for you, you then take him, my enemy, you take him, my enemy, as your ally. Then in that case, you've done what? You've become my enemy, right or wrong? Because the allies of my enemies are my enemies. They are one of them, right? How could you do that? I did all this for you. And then he says, how could you do this? وَهُمْ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌّ. And it's not even like he's doing anything for you. He can't stand you. He hates you. He's your enemy. It's not like you're getting anything out of it. Ibn al-Qayyim comments on this sort of reflection. He says that the enmity between you two is bigger than the enmity between the lamb and the wolf. It's not an exact analogy. It's bigger. There's bigger animosity. Why? Why is the enmity between the human and the shaitan more intense than the enmity between the wolf and the lamb? Think with me, folks. The wolf's got to eat, guys. No hard feelings. I'm really sorry, bro, but I got to eat. No, it's not personal. With Shaytan, it is personal. He's sadistic. He is the definition of sadistic. I'm going to hurt you even if I get nothing out of it. He's malicious. So it's worse than the wolf's attack of the lamb. So how could you accept him as your ally? And the third part, Ibn al-Qayyim says this with a degree of speculation, meaning he says, and perhaps also the benefit of the ayah being worded in this wonderful way, it's as if Allah is saying, you know why he's my enemy? Yes, he disobeyed me, but he's my enemy because of you. I kicked him out because he refused to prostrate to you. And then you take him? How could you? Like, it's not just that he disobeyed me about some issue far away from you. It's the fact that I kicked him out for refusing to obey me in honoring you. Then you go and say truce? بِئْسَ لِلظَّالِمِينَ بَدَلًا. That's why the ayah begins with saying, what an awful exchange. Then fourthly, this is the fourth stop here that Ibn al-Qayyim makes. He says, and does Shaytan even need leverage against you? When he is not sleeping when you're sleeping. Right? You work 8 hours and chill 8 hours and sleep 8 hours. No. He puts in like 20-hour shifts to ruin you. He's saying when you're sleeping, he doesn't sleep. And when you forget he's there, he doesn't forget his mission. And he sees you and you can't see him. And he never wastes an opportunity to harm you. By the way, every single one of these sort of points have an ayah or a hadith behind them. But Ibn al-Qayyim is just weaving it together in this just amazingly smooth way. Like the Prophet ﷺ, for example, about not wasting a moment. The moment you come out of your mother's stomach, you come out screaming. The Prophet ﷺ said that is because Shaytan stabs you as soon as you're born. What does stabs you mean? I hate you. Harmless baby. Doesn't even know its own name yet. You need to know that I hate you. Right? So he doesn't waste an opportunity. And he provokes others against you. He provokes his fellow humans, against this person. That's an ayah in the Quran as well. إِنَّمَا ذَلِكُمُ الشَّيْطَانُ يُخَوِّفُ أَوْلِيَاءَ. This is nothing but Shaytan causing you to be afraid of his people, the human shayateen. So Ibn al-Qayyim is not saying any of these ayat or hadith. He's just rattling it off for you that he already has a lot of leverage. He says, and he sets up traps for you on every path. And he says to all of his followers, there he is, there she is, your enemy and the enemy of your father, meaning me. Don't let him slip so that he gets paradise and we get the fire. And he gets mercy and we get God's curse. He's coming down with us. We're going to tear him down with us. And then Ibn al-Qayyim, this is now sort of the other side of the coin here. He says, and the only reason Allah allowed this monster, Shaytan, anywhere near his believing slaves is because jihad is the most beloved act to Allah. You see, many things in this deen are natural and beautiful and feel good to do them, right? But that's not the true measure of your commitment to Allah. It's the struggle. You should do those, don't get me wrong. But it's the times when your desires want to go one way and Allah wants you to go somewhere else that it's time for jihad. The jihad of emotions. And Allah loves to see it from you. Loves to see that you want to go a certain direction, but for His sake, you're going to force yourself another way. At those crossroads, that jihad from within, Allah loves to see it from you. That's why He allows this to happen. That's why Shaitan is even allowed to exist. Allah did not just kill him, destroy him, lock him away somewhere when he first fell from grace. He says He only allowed him near his believing slaves because this jihad against Shaitan is the most beloved thing to him. He said, and because the heart is the most beloved of His creation to Him, the heart of the believer. The heart is the point of access to Allah. The heart is the organ, if I can call it that is able to know Allah. How do you know Allah? The knowledge He reveals, when you embrace it and commit yourself to it, you develop a spiritual knowing of Allah, an awareness, a recognition, not just ilm, not a theoretical, but ma'rifah. You become acquainted with Allah. He's saying, and so since this is the most beloved thing to Him, you have to earn your own heart by wrestling it away from Shaitan or keeping Shaitan out of it, should we say. Does that make sense? So it's the jihad against Shaitan, the jihad over your heart. That tug of war is what Allah loves to see. He said, but Allah knew how much ill intentions Shaitan had and how much firm resolve Shaitan had to destroy this heart of yours. And so He gave you assets for this lifelong jihad. He gave you angels that around the clock are praying for you, if you deserve them. If you keep the angels around, they'll support you, right? He says, and He gave you revelation to expose His plots. Everything I'm reading to you today or summarizing for you are ayat and hadith, right? It's realities revealed to us about the unseen. And he gave you, so the angels, around the clock. And then there's revelation to strengthen you. And then he gave you a mind. You're not some animal. You know, they say, what is the difference between human intellect and animal intellect? They call it metacognition. Basically, you have superior intelligence, the ability to think about the way you think. It's like, wait a minute, I know that trap, right? I've followed this pattern a few times before, right? So he gave you the ability to reflect on yourself and your behavior and your past for the future. So he gave you intellect, special intellect. And then he gave you faith and certainty. He gave you yaqeen. That's your firepower, right? He says, and so now you have to employ all of that to strategize in the war against Shaytan. He has waged war on you. You have to engage in battle. Your mind, with it you will strategize, and your heart will fuel you. It will motivate you, the faith in your heart. He says, and so now you are the commander, and you have troops on the outside and on the inside. He'll explain this later. Troops on the outside and the inside, and the angels and even the bearers of Allah's throne are praying for you that you don't slip, and that when you do slip, you are forgiven before your slip-ups finish you once and for all. So he's painting for you a picture. He's trying to tell you it's not fantasy. It's not imaginary. You are asleep at war. This is a war. And then he does one of the most creative things, in my limited reading of several of Ibn al-Qayyim's books, the most creative thing I've ever seen him do. And he's extremely creative, extremely eloquent. He goes on to about 15 pages of illustrating, drawing out for you a scene from the war for you to understand just how Shaytan works, methodically, strategically. He says, now, you understand all this, and I'm, of course, running through it. Now you need to watch, meaning with the eyes of your heart. Watch as the war unfolds within you, and the two battle ranks collide. And you win ground here, and he wins ground there. It's a back and forth, right? I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to read for you like most of the rest, verbatim. He says, and the king of kufr, Malikul Kufr, which is Shaytan, the king of disbelief, approaches with his army and his soldiers. And he finds that heart of yours inside its fortress, sitting on top of its throne, the throne of its kingdom. It sees you on top of your game, right? And its commands are immediately carried out. Like, you got a good heart, it's making you do the right things, the limbs are listening to the heart, right? Its commands are carried out. And its soldiers are ready to protect it with their lives from all sides. So he is unable to attack directly. He realizes this. Not without first turning some of its ministers, the ministers of the king, some of the governors, right? The lower level officials. Some of the governors and soldiers against this heart. So he asks his scouts. He asks about the king's nearest and most trusted officials who are really in his ear. And he is told it is his nafs. It's like the appetite of the human being, the lower appetites, those things we are fond of, that we want immediately, and we want so badly. So he says, it's the nafs, it's the appetite. Figure out what it likes, because every person is different. Figure out what it likes, and promise it an endless supply of that. And grow its interest for that appetite, accentuate the appetite. And carve an image of whatever they like in front of them, so they daydream about it when they're awake, and they dream about it when they're asleep. Until it fixates on this image, and then when it's there, when it's hypnotized by the image of the thing they're so enticed about, then cast your hooks and drag the nafs towards you by its feet. Look at the imagery. You know, there's another book for Ibn al-Qayyim solely on Shaytan, like the traps of Shaytan for all different types of human beings. How he tricked Christians, how he tricked like mujahideen among the Muslimin, how he tricked these kinds of scholars, those kinds of scholars. It's called Ighathul Lahfan, rescuing the bewildered person min fi masayid al-Shaytan, that is caught in the traps of Shaytan. So in that book, he also gives another image that I'll just sort of invoke here. He says, Shaytan, the scouts of Shaytan, they go up to a person and they they smell him. You know, like a dog trying to take in a scent. He says yusham min nafs. He takes you in and he figures out what kind of person are you. So like if you're a hard worker, that's your personality type, he'll make you work harder till you burn out. Whether in dunya or in deen, right? But likely in deen. If you're the slacker, the negligent type, he'll push you in that direction. Say, yeah, man, slacking is the thing to do, and there's always tomorrow, and keeps pushing until you slack between the bare minimum, the pass-fail line. And he causes you to think that what you're doing is the best thing out there. You accentuate the desire to work hard, the desire to slack off. You know, I was speaking to a brother recently who struggled with just online addictions, lust and online addictions and the likes. After like a year or two of recovery, he said to me, you know, only after I grew out of it and I healed from this addiction, did I realize that I was actually addicted to what I thought this would give me. But this stuff, like, what's this really worth? Like this physical what is it? What is it? It's 5 minutes out of the day? How does my 24 hours revolve around it? It was actually the imaginary image of what it could offer me, and it never can. It's so oversold, as the way he put it. That's what Shaytan does. So once you're there, that's when he has you. And he pulls you over. Or basically he says, he pulls the nafs over. The appetites are in his hands. Then he continues his lecture. The Shaytan continues. He's giving a lecture to his troops, right? He says, once the appetite is compromised, only then will you gain control of the trenches around the fortress. He says one trench is called the trench of the eyes. One trench is called the trench of the ears. There's the trench of the tongue. The trench of the mouth, the hand, and the foot. He said, once you win over these trenches, you make up that much ground in the battle, don't give back these trenches. Because if you're able to hold, you will either kill the heart, or you will fatally wound the heart, or you'll severely injure the heart. And if you see reinforcements arrive for this heart, don't let them in. What's reinforcements? A reminder, an ayah, a hadith, a lecture, a wake-up call, you know, some disappointment with the temptation, right? Any reinforcements come, don't let them into the heart. You see them trying to get in? Weaken it at all costs, this reinforcement, this battalion that's coming. And if you can't stop it, then weaken it so it arrives weak and meaningless. And he'll give some examples of this. He said, so the trench of the eyes, he says you have to stop this heart, this person, from looking in a way that is thoughtful, a way that is reflecting. Anytime he looks at anything, it has to be purely for what? Amusement, entertainment, that's it. And if it steals a useful glance, if it looks a little bit in their Quran app, right? If it looks a little bit the creation of Allah and says, subhanallah, if it steals a useful glance, ruin it with desires of what it can have now. Because he said it's easier to offer it what it can have now than to cause it to think about later, the akhirah, the hereafter. Give it something immediate. Give it some low-hanging fruit. Remind it of something it can have right now. Doesn't have to be the haram, but just interrupt that reflection. It's looking at Allah's creation, said, I want some ice cream. Right? Just interrupt. He said, and I've never been able to destroy the human beings, he's saying to his army, through anything more effective than the eye. Through it, I cast the seeds of desires into their hearts. If I can just get them to look, right? That's it. That's the spark, all the spark I need. Through it, I cast the seeds of desires in the heart. And then I water it with empty wishes. You're going to have, and it's going to be so nice. And then continue caring for it until it strengthens and disqualifies them from Allah's protection. With what? A glance. He says, then there's the trench of the ear. You have to prevent anything from entering that ear that will spoil your mission. Surround him with voices of vanity, useless things, and falsehood, lies. And work hard to sweeten the phrases. Don't be sloppy, he's telling them. Sweeten the phrases for them. Put in work. And make fancy the language until their intellects are bewitched. He said, and try different things. Throw a word out there. And if they dwell on it, throw another one. Send more of it his way. Until he can't think of anything else. What does it sound like, by the way? Huh? Sounds like algorithms, doesn't it? What, you know, the algorithms don't even sort of study you based on what you click anymore. They study you based on how long you dwell within the scroll at a certain image, at a certain section of the page. Right? It is quite scary. Ibn al-Qayyim wrote this how long ago? 700 years ago. And now technology has put it sort of on autopilot. AI, right? Like, but still, the solution is already in the Quran, right? Lower your gaze. Don't underestimate the glance. And then the hearing. And he says to his troops, and don't you dare let any of the words of Allah and His Messenger sneak inside. Don't let him sit there and hear ayat. Let him sit there and hear a hadith. Or the words of any sincere advisor. When the parents are talking to them, when the shaykh is speaking, when the honest friend is speaking, mess the frequency, mess with the channels, right? Get in the way. He says, and if these words, Allah, His Messenger, advisors, if they slip past you, create obstacles for him, between him and understanding them, or deeply thinking about them if he understands them. Or admit the opposite along with them, right? It's probably not true anyway, right? Or suggest to him that it's far-fetched. I can't be that good person. Yes, it's true, but I'm just not cut for this religious stuff, this piety stuff. Or not worth pursuing, right? Like tell him, yeah, it's true and it's great, but it's very high cost, and you're not going to harvest it now. That's a lie Shaytan poses, right? You're only going to harvest your righteousness later. That's not true. You're going to get it now and later. But just how he crowds it. All these different thoughts he's saying. Nobody else is doing this. Nobody does this. You're going to be a weirdo. That's another one he throws, right? It's going to cause a lot of problems. And you know, Allah doesn't ask you to put yourself through all of these different problems. This is beyond your capacity, and Allah will never ask you beyond your capacity, right? You know, it is so interesting how, if you haven't noticed, by the way, this June, so-called Pride Month, has been a really bad Pride Month for them, for the LGBT lobby, like compared to previous years. Why? Because everyone was afraid to push back. That, wait a minute, you guys are not asking us to accept you. You guys are asking us to support you. And so this is intolerant of you. We are not being so it clicked with some people, right? And so a few people, some Muslims, some Christians, some others, believe it or not, just kicked the door right on the conversation. They just spoke up, right? And when they spoke up, everyone else started saying, yeah, yeah, yeah. It started echoing. And that's why so many companies started realizing, oh man, we're losing money here. We're no longer going to require sort of the colors, the pride colors on our logos anymore. All of that was Shaytan. Telling people, right? It's too complicated. This is sort of like no one is against this anymore. You can't really resist it anymore. It took a few people. It was Shaytan. That's like on the macro level. But also on the smaller level, be like, oh, you're going to be the only guy praying at work. No one really does that, and you know, you can probably combine prayers when you get home, and it's going to be weird. It's not going to be weird. Your coworker might become Muslim, by the way, right? You might sue your boss and get more money than you'll ever make on your salary if they dare to try to, you know, prevent you from religious observance. It's just Shaytan. So many of these times, at least. Pushback is easier than you think, but he crowds those words of righteousness. And then he says, and my soldiers, I want you to memorize this wasiyah from me. Here's like a secret weapon I want to tell you. I want you to tag team. One of you should cause his human friend to say a word, to throw a word at him. We're still talking about the ear, right? To utter something, while the other shaitan, who's at the ear of the other human being, to take it and to ease it in, right? Tag team for each other. Make him say the right thing at the right time after studying this person's Achilles heels, their weak spots. And sell it to them and beautify it for them in their eyes. He says, then there's the trench of the tongue. You never cause them to say anything but falsehood. Because when you say it, you're more committed to it in general. The tongue is the X factor in the heart, as the hadith say. And if there's truth to be said, make sure you hold their tongue so they're silent about the truth. If you can get them to speak falsehood, you can get them to be silent about the truth, they will be trapped in misguidance after that. He said, and this is what I destroyed the children of Adam with, meaning sealed the deal on them with, and tossed them on their noses in the hellfire because of. These are all hadith, by the way. What else throws people on their noses in the fire but the harvest of their tongues? That's a hadith. So he's just weaving it all together as statements of shaitan. Do that. This is the biggest thing I throw people on the fire with. And I cannot count how many victims I have just from the gate of the tongue. And just like you did with the eye, just like you did with the ear, just like you did with the tongue, stand there getting in the way of the heart on every path. You know, there's a hadith to this wording where the Prophet ﷺ says, إن الشيطان قعد لابن آدم على أطرقه كلها. That shaitan has stood in obstruction in the way of the son of Adam on every path he takes. And then he gave 3 examples. He says, قعد له في طريق الإسلام. He stood in the way of him becoming Muslim. So someone is convinced, this is the truth, I gotta accept it. Shaitan says to him, are you going to disown your religion? The religion you grew up on, the religion of your parents, were they fools? And he'll continue to shame him so he doesn't become Muslim. Are you going to break up the family? Are you going, and like that. And so he defies him and he becomes Muslim. And then he sits there in front of him on the gate of hijrah, of migrating, to a place more pleasing to Allah and His Messenger. And he says to him, أَتَذَرُ أَرْضَكَ وَسَمَاءَكَ. You're actually going to migrate away from your homeland and leave everything you've ever known and go to a place that's filled with unknowns and like that. So he opposes him and he migrates. And then he sits there in front of him on the path to Jihad when he is called to fight in the path of Allah, for instance, right? And Shaitan says to him, تُجَاهِد, you're going to go out and fight. فَتُقْتَلْ, and you're going to get killed. فَيُقَسَّمُ الْأَمْوَالِ وَتُنْكَحُ الزَّوْجَ, and your wealth that you worked so hard on is going to get all distributed. And your wife is going to go marry somebody else, and she's not even going to remember you anymore. And he begins to harass him in this way, yet he defies him and goes off to jihad. So this is from the Prophet ﷺ himself. Ibn al-Qayyim takes that now and says, it's time for sadaqah. Shaitan's going to come and say it. Like, you want to become like the guy who's humiliated asking you for money right now? You're going to become that beggar one day. You know this guy, how he feels inside, feeling like a nobody. You know that he can't sleep at night. You know this. You know he's so worried about his debts. You're going to do this. You sure you want to give this charity? And if he can't get him to stop giving charity, he'll get him to lessen his charity. He's relentless. He'll get what he can take for now until he can get more. And then when it's time for Hajj, he'll tell you it's dangerous. Tell you, you don't know what's going to happen. What if you get lost? Right? What if you get sick? What if you can't get to a doctor in time? What if this and what if that? Until, Allah forbid, you give that up. And then he says to him, and we're working our way to the close now, and if you find anyone gathering, like a gathering of people, like you all, you guys are all the enemies of Shaitan. Say Alhamdulillah. If you find any people in a gathering about to disrupt your project, your war plans, meaning the gatherings of dhikr and the gatherings where the deen of Allah is studied, then separate them. Cause disunity, start fights between them. Separates them. And if you can't separate them, then cause commotion among them through other human beings. Distract them, cause commotion, whatever it may be. Even if the inner core, their hearts are together, at least separate their bodies. Get in their way. He says, because their Lord said to them that these gatherings are surrounded by the angels, meaning shayateen can't enter. That's how much Shaytan despises the masjid, despises the gatherings of dhikr, the gatherings of studying. He said, and those are all the good deeds. He tells his soldiers, don't forget about the bad deeds. On the path of sins, beautify them and make good use of them. Be strategic. Don't just throw any random suggestion at them. He said, but there is one suggestion that hardly ever fails. Make use of women. They are your biggest helpers. Why does he say that? Because women are inherently evil, right? Don't you dare. Sisters, nobody said yes. I swear to you. None of them said yes. Is because it is our biggest weakness. Allah Azza wa Jal in Surah Ali Imran, when he said, Zuyyina linnas, it was beautified for people, hubbu shahawat, their inclination to their desires. He mentions 8 distinct desires that are pretty universal, but he begins with the greatest desire of all in terms of its impact. He said, An-Nisa, the women. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, I have not left a trial behind after me, meaning this will continue being the standard until the end of time. More dangerous to the men of my ummah than women. Right? This is, and that is why one of the greatest rewards Allah speaks about in Jannah is that unimaginable brides. Why? Because this is the biggest fight you will have to fight for as long as you live. You know Sheikh Yusuf Estes. You guys know Sheikh Yusuf Estes. MashaAllah, he's a priest who became Muslim, has been involved in the da'wah since they became Muslim. He's well into his 70s now. A few years ago I heard him say, I asked my father, his father is, almost 90, when does a guy stop looking at women? And my dad said to me, ask somebody older than me. He's probably joking, but the idea is it does linger. It does linger, and it's a true test. And Shaytan knows this, that so many men in their right mind lost their discretion and sabotaged their deen because they couldn't keep that temptation in check. So he says, so use women. He says, but also keep in mind that there is a path for all the other desires. Light the fires inside them that work best. For some people it would be the fire of lust, like what we just said. And for many people, he says, it will be the fire of anger. Get them to do things they can't take back. Say things they can't erase, right? The fire of anger. And whenever they put out this fire of anger that you light inside them, you stoke inside them, whenever you find them putting it out with wudu, washing for prayer, and salah, and glorifying Allah, then you need to fight them then to the death that this is a one-off, that they're going to make salah one time and skip it 10 times, right? Make sure this is the exception and not the rule, that they're not regularly making salah, regularly glorifying Allah. You fight them to the death to make sure this is a one-off. And you need to understand why Allah said, Shaytan is telling them, understand why Allah said, وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ. Seek strength through patience and prayer. Because if they become patient people who can oppose their desires and they turn to the prayer, you need to run for your life. The Shaytan is saying, you should run for your life. Because Ibn al-Qayyim, he actually says this elsewhere, that what does it mean that Shaytan is your clear enemy? You find throughout the Quran, aduwwu mubin, aduwwu, your clear enemy. He says, you can't see him, so how is he your clear enemy? Answer, help me. What does it mean? It means it's crystal clear that he's your enemy. He's your truest enemy. He's not even an enemy you can negotiate with, right? So it's not like, oh, let me treat Shaytan nice so that he stops bothering me, and let me leave some cookies outside at night or something. No, Shaytan will accept nothing but for you to be beneath him in the fire. Nothing else. clear. There's no doubt that you should ever have about that mentality of Shaytan, that intention of Shaytan. So if that's the case, the only solution is what? To assassinate him before he assassinates you. Sorry for the radicalized language. But that's what Ibn al-Qayyim says. He goes, so when you know that, you have to then torment him with your ibadah, or else he will torment you in the fire. There's no other option. No truces, no tie, no leave it to the judges, see who got more hits. It's a fight to the death, he's saying. So the more you are patient, you grow your patience, the more you grow your consistency in the prayer, the more you glorify Allah, the more you attend gatherings where Allah is glorified, each one of those torments Shaitan, it tortures him. So you will either torture him with your devotion to Allah, or he will torture you in the pits of the fire for giving him leverage by distancing yourself from Allah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. May Allah protect us from Shaitan and his traps, and help us gain the insight about ourselves and about these realities that will make us the biggest winners in this world and the next, and the most distant from being victimized by Shaitan and his relentless plots. Allahumma ameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.